Okay, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening to all of you who have joined. Thank you so much for making the time to participate in today's webinar. My name is Sarah Douglas, and I am the Gender Advisor of PBSO. Today's webinar is the third webinar in our series on the Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative, and this one is focusing on gender-responsive peace building. So I'm going to run through a presentation quickly, and then we will have time for questions and answers at the end. And please feel free throughout the webinar to put your questions into the chat box. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions in French at the end of the presentation.
Alors, pour les francophones, il y a la possibilité de poser les questions en français à la fin.
Okay, great. So, first, the agenda for today's webinar. Many of you are very familiar with these topics, but this is an opportunity to go through some of the priorities from the perspective of PBSO and the Peacebuilding Fund and try to support a common vision and understanding of gender-responsive peace building amongst the colleagues who are applying for the Gender Promotion Initiative. So we will go through an overview of the GPI and then also a little bit more detail about the types of interventions and the lessons learned from the last experiences that we've had over the past 6 years. So the first question is, why do a GPI? Many of you have been involved before, and you know that the Peacebuilding Support Office is a strong champion of the gender-responsive peacebuilding agenda and the 1325 resolutions and all the subsequent resolutions. And there are several reasons for this. The first is that we have now insurmountable evidence that women's participation actually improves peace-building outcomes. Some of you will be familiar with the global study on 1325 that came out in 2015 that consolidated this evidence base and showed data about how women's participation improves the sustainability of peace agreements, how women contribute a disproportionate amount of their economic peace dividends into family and social well-being in the community. So we have this kind of insurmountable and increasingly large body of evidence that shows that women's participation actually improves peace building. Secondly, as a UN system, we are committed to achieving gender equality and supporting the empowerment of women as a goal in its own right. So whether or not it improves the outcome of peace building or not, you all are aware of the adoption of Sustainable Development Goal 5 that's specifically targeted on gender equality and women's empowerment, as well as many other agendas, mandates, platforms over the years that demonstrate the United Nations commitment to gender equality as a goal in itself. Thirdly, more specifically to peace building, we have a very strong mandate from the Secretary General's 7-point action plan on gender responsive peace building, which was developed in 2010, also as a response to the 10-year anniversary of Resolution 1325, which, among other things, called for increased financing and increased targeted interventions and monitoring and evaluation kind of frameworks of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So one of the specific comments in mandates in that action plan is to allocate a minimum of 15% of all peace building funds that are managed by the UN to gender equality and women's empowerment. The Peacebuilding Support Office in particular took a very strong leadership role in achieving this target. We found after the first couple of years that it was not sufficient to rely only on the regular process, but actually we had to have a more targeted window open to only projects on gender so that we would be able to reach and exceed this target. And by the way, 2015 was the first year that we achieved the target, and then last year we actually exceeded it, going to 19.2%, also largely attributable to the success of the last year's Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative. And then lastly, obviously you're all aware of the Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, and the most recent one, 2242, which specifically calls for increased financing of women, peace, and security interventions at the country level. So I don't want to go into too much detail here, but we have the 7 points of the Secretary General's 7-point action plan, which basically cover a mix of thematic areas as well as process-oriented measures. And you can see here we have the first is regarding peace talks and peace processes. Secondly, post-conflict planning processes involving women substantively. Thirdly, adequate financing, which is what I was just referring to, which established the 15% target. Fourthly, increasing the UN civil capacity to ensure that colleagues in the field have adequate skills and expertise in gender-responsive peace building. 5, that women participate in post-conflict governance, including in elections, public institutions, etc. 6, that rule of law encourages women's participation as well as improving the capacity and responsiveness of security actors. And 7th, finally, economic recovery, prioritizing women's participation and economic security of women in post-conflict and peace-building contexts. So specifically the objectives of this Gender Promotion Initiative in 2017 are 5-fold. Firstly, to strengthen the integration of gender equality within peace-building initiatives, as I mentioned, based on our understanding of the effectiveness and right of women to participate in peace building. Secondly, to support innovation and projects that could potentially have a catalytic effect on both women's empowerment and peace building. Thirdly, to contribute to collective operational learning and knowledge on gender responsive programming in peace building contexts. Fourthly, to accelerate the implementation of the 7-point action plan. And lastly, to help us maintain our good progress on the 15% target. So one more word on a new mandate that is still in the process of being fully reflected into our documents and our doctrine. Last year, the Security Council and the General Assembly passed simultaneous resolutions on sustaining peace. And this was a watershed moment in that it did away with the notion that peace building is only something that has that occurs after conflict, but rather that sustaining peace occurs prior, during, and after conflict. So really doing away with the kind of linear approach to conflict and also focusing much more on prevention. So the resolutions really put sustaining peace at the core by prioritizing a preventive approach across the conflict cycle, acknowledging that conflicts are not linear, calling for breaking silos and combating fragmentation between the UN system, also between humanitarian development and peace and security interventions, exploring the linkages between the different pillars and actors at the country level, emphasizing inclusivity and people-centered approaches for successful peace building, and placing women's participation and gender equality at the center of sustaining peace. And also the sustaining peace resolutions specifically call for increased financing of gender responsive peace building at the country level. So this is a repetition from some of our previous webinars, but just for the benefit of all of the colleagues, who can apply and how. So CSOs can apply for funding, and this is the second time, last year was the first time that we opened up this window to civil society, and that was also in reference to the resolutions and the review of the peacebuilding architecture that occurred in 2015 that emphasized the important role that civil society plays in conflict prevention and sustaining peace. So civil society can apply for funding directly, 2 projects per initiative for each organization. The minimum is $300,000 US, and the maximum is $2 million. Then UN country teams can submit 2 proposals under the GPI for each country. For UN partners, joint proposals are strongly encouraged, no more than 2 or 3 partners per project. The minimum is $800,000 and the maximum is $2 million. Also, UN entities and civil society organizations must partner with national and local civil society organizations, and at least 40% of the budget should go to national CSOs. We've had a lot of questions about that already from different partners and emails submitted to the info address. And just to clarify that this 40% is a guideline, it's not something that we are measuring very strictly. The purpose and the vision of this requirement is really that we want colleagues and projects at the country level to engage with local actors and to support the capacity building of local partners that are the sort of front line for peace building and conflict prevention. So, for example, there have been some questions about, do the local partners need to be registered? Do they need to be co-implementing partners? Do they need to produce financial reports? And the answer to all of those questions is that we are not looking at that level of detail. It's up to you to determine how the partnerships with local actors should work, but the purpose is that we want the spirit of the partnership with civil society at the local level to be reflected in the development of the proposal as well as in the budget. So as most of you should know, we have 20 eligible countries, and they are here now on the slide: Burundi, CAR, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, DRC, Guatemala, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Kyrgyzstan, Liberia, Madagascar, Mali, Myanmar, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, and Yemen. And also, just to clarify that these 20 countries are the countries that are officially eligible for peacebuilding funds, and they each went through a process of obtaining that eligibility whereby the governments and the UN country teams at the national level submitted an official request at some point, and in some cases it could be many years ago, to the Secretary General, specifically requesting eligibility to the fund. So this is also very important to us as the Peacebuilding Support Office, because their eligibility shows that the commitment of the government is very high and that there is political will for peace building in the country. So the next part of the presentation is more specifically about the GPI projects and what types of interventions the PBF will support under the Gender Promotion Initiative. Here are a couple of examples, but this is not exhaustive. What types of interventions we will support: facilitating women's access to decision-making, facilitating women's participation in elections or governance, innovative ways to integrate gender in justice and SSR, natural resource management and climate change mitigation in the context of peace building,
Yeah.
Women's participation in conflict prevention, early warning, mediation. Women's role in preventing violent extremism and terrorism in line with Resolution 2242. Projects involving the use of social media and innovative technologies for peace building, and also women's participation in economic recovery for peace building. Now, let me emphasize, this is not an exhaustive list. One of the things that you'll hear emphasized throughout the webinars is that whatever interventions are proposed must be based on a sound conflict analysis, let's say a gender-sensitive conflict analysis. So even the list that I just gave you is really just illustrative. There could be all kinds of initiatives and interventions that would be relevant in different contexts, depending on the analysis that you set out in your proposal. So that's really the key thing to remember, that the interventions must follow a very clear conflict analysis that is gender sensitive, and then we are open to any type of intervention that fits the bill in that regard. Okay, so we've also listed here a couple of all the previous GPI projects from 2016, 2014, and 2013. And we were hoping to have hyperlinks to these projects, but they're not, the hyperlinks are not working. So we'll put the this up on the website in Word so that you can easily access the hyperlinks, which will give you on the resource section of the website. So this gives you an examples of projects that have been successful in the past. So it's very useful to look at the successful projects and see what the different colleagues have done to make the project successful. And the good thing is also there's a mix of English and French here, so it's a good resource for all of the colleagues. So here's the list for 2016. And then this is the list for 2014. You can see quite a range of countries and different topics, from access to land to political participation. And then here the projects from 2011, which was the first year that we did the initiative. So just again, we'll put all of these on the resource section of the website so that you can easily access of all of these projects. So lessons learned from the previous GPIs. Successful projects did three things very clearly. The first one was that they made a very clear link between the activities and a peace-building outcome. It's important to remember that this is the UN Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund. So whatever funds we support, whatever projects we support, have to be very, very, very clearly linked to peace building. So any type of intervention you want to propose, be it natural resource management, be it economic security, be it rule of law and justice activities, must make a clear link to the actual peace building goals and strategies of the country. Secondly, successful projects have laid out specific and tangible results that are based on a clear and thorough conflict analysis. So some of that I already mentioned, that we are open to any type of activity that has is grounded in a strong identification of the needs and the priorities in the country. But also the other important part of that is that we are looking for specific and tangible results. Thirdly, the issue of theory of change. So the theory of change is what connects the conflict analysis to the actual results. And it's very important that the theory of change shows how the activities that are proposed will actually lead to the results that are desired based on the conflict analysis. There will be subsequent webinars next week on conflict analysis and theory of change, and the week after that on monitoring and evaluation. And I really encourage you to participate in those because they will be very helpful to figure out how the activities that you have in mind can be tied together through a good and sound theory of change. So many of the unsuccessful projects focused on something related to gender equality programming, but failed to make the link to peace building. In the case of the gender promotion initiatives, we found many projects that were, for example, focused on gender-based violence, which of course is a peace and security issue and is a peace building issue, but the project failed to make a difference or differentiate how the approach was actually linked to the peace building priorities of the country. So basically a project on GBV, it could be a successful project, for example, but the project has to explain how this is different in Liberia, let's say, from what we would do in Ghana, or what we would do differently in Papua New Guinea versus Indonesia. So that differentiation between a project that might have a more development or human rights or gender equality outcome, we need this project to have a peace building outcome. Secondly, a big pitfall for the previous projects were projects that were very vague, that talked about organizing women's constituencies for peace, workshops and trainings, and capacity building without really showing how those would be connected to a concrete result. So those were the two major pitfalls for previous projects. So here are some useful resources. We've mentioned a lot already the importance of a sound conflict analysis and a gender-sensitive conflict analysis. Conciliation Resources came out with a very good gender and conflict analysis toolkit that is useful. There's also the UN Women's Sourcebook on Women, Peace, and Security, which has a lot of tools and research that is useful for also Implementation of 1325 is an encyclopedia of women, peace, and security with lots of relevant facts and data and useful arguments that can support your analysis. Fourthly, the Peace Women Resource Center is also a useful online repository of data and information where you can find country-specific articles and research papers that could also be useful in building your theory of change. And lastly, the International Alert Gender and Peace Building Research Project also has a lot of useful toolkits and articles, including one specifically on monitoring and evaluation of gender responsive peace building that I'll actually put that one specifically up on the resource page as well. So when the project appraisal committee meets at the end of July to review the projects, this is what they're going to be looking for. Firstly, they're going to be looking for a link to peace building. You've seen in the guidelines the 4 priority areas of the Peacebuilding Fund, so we're going to be looking for the project to link to those 4 areas. We're also looking for a linkage to the national commitments and also action from the national partners on gender and peace building. Oops, that's a typo there. It should be gender or women and peace building. But we're looking for a linkage to the national commitments and priorities. We're looking for inclusive bottom-up approaches and also evidence of consultation and a broad base of constituents. We're looking for a clear theory of change. We're looking for focused and targeted interventions. And we're also looking for value for money. There have been a lot of questions about staffing and overhead costs. And we also don't have very strict rules. For UN partners, we obviously expect you to be taking your 7% as it's the normal practice. We don't have clear guidelines on overhead costs, but we do look at that, and we will not fund a project that has a exorbitant or too heavily focused budget on overhead costs. So we don't have a strict guideline, but it is something that we consider in terms of value for money. And then also, even though this is a gender promotion initiative, we are still looking favorably on projects that consider age and youth. Conversely, the youth projects are also evaluated for how they consider gender. So we want to see that also the gender projects are looking at youth to some degree. Okay, so the last slide before we open up for questions are the next steps. So as I mentioned already, there will be 2 more webinars, and we really encourage you to avail of this opportunity. The next one on Wednesday, the 21st, will be on conflict analysis and theory of change, which is really important. And then the next one on the 28th will be on monitoring and evaluation. So we really encourage you to participate in those. Please be advised that we have changed the rules slightly this year, that there will be no individual support to projects. We want this to be a fully competitive process. And also, given the very high level of interest that we had last year with over 400 proposals being submitted at the first phase, we don't have the ability to look through individual proposals. But we are preparing frequently asked questions and a resource section on the website. So email your questions to the email address info@pbfgypi.org. And we'll put that in the comment box now. And we will be collecting those questions and putting answers to the questions up on the website on a regular basis. And we'll also be updating the resource page on a regular basis to provide useful information and guidelines and toolkits, etc. So the deadline for the online application is the 7th of July. We're expecting to do the review process over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. We will communicate the final decision, we are hoping, tentatively by the end of July, after which successful proposals will have 6 weeks to then develop fully fledged proposals based on our guidelines and templates. And then hopefully the final decision will be at the end of September with the transfer of funds sometime in October. So that's all from our side. And now we've had some questions already answered in the box. And please also be aware you can ask questions in French. You want to just say again, you can ask questions in French?
Oui, bonjour collègues, juste pour vous dire que vous pouvez poser des questions en français en utilisant la chat box sur votre écran. Merci.
Okay. So we had one question, should it be linked to all PBF priority areas or just one? It should be linked to one priority area, but there can be several focus areas. As I mentioned already, one of the pitfalls of previous projects is a lack of focus. So we would really encourage you to focus on a minimum of one priority, and the priorities are already very broad. and then focus on one or more focus areas within the priority areas, but really to stress that we want you to really focus the interventions and try to be as targeted as possible, because projects that were not specific were one of the main reasons for failure in the previous processes. Okay. Okay. So another question is, considering that a conflict analysis is an ongoing process, can we base our project on previous needs analyses we've done for other projects and other analyses that have been conducted by other NGOs and INGOs, or do you expect that we conduct a new gender-sensitive conflict analysis? That's absolutely fine to use an existing analysis. That's actually great, because we want to promote as much efficiency and streamlining as possible. But I would just advise that it must be current and up to date. The project will be reviewed by our desk officers in the Peacebuilding Fund, who are watching these countries on a daily basis. So a conflict analysis that is out of date would not be useful, and it would be immediately spotted by our desk officers who are very, very well versed in the developments of each.
No, I am here. I'm just listening to a webinar. I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, another one. Out of 400 proposals last year, how many were funded? We actually ended up funding 13 only in total, 10 from the Gender Promotion Initiative and 3 from the Youth Promotion Initiative. We really struggled to find projects that were of high enough quality and as relevant to our mandate as possible. And this was due to the reasons that I told you earlier. Some of the proposals that were submitted were not eligible. Others were too vague. A lot were maybe very good projects but did not link clearly to peace building. So we actually did not reach our allocation target, and we're hoping that this year we'll be able to fund many more. So another one is another question. Looking at previous funded projects, they all seem to have been submitted by UN agencies. Have NGOs only recently been allowed to submit, or are the UN agencies preferred? Actually, 2016 is the first year that we funded NGOs directly. We, according to the Peacebuilding Fund's original guidelines and rules, it was only for UN agencies. And last year, for the first time, we opened up to NGOs, which was quite a learning process. And we're trying to utilize some of the lessons learned this time. But because of the sustaining peace resolutions, there was a real feeling that we needed to engage civil society directly through the Peacebuilding Fund. So we decided to do it again this year, and we'll see how it goes this year and possibly open up in future years as well. Okay.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions in French. I'm going to answer in French and then give a quick summary in English. Donc, il y a une question sur la radicalisation. Est-ce que la radicalisation est un phénomène purement religieux et l'importance de travailler avec les hommes et notamment les imams. Alors, bon, on ne va pas se lancer sur une discussion sur les différents facteurs de la radicalisation puisque c'est un sujet très vaste. Ce que je voudrais souligner ici, c'est que l'initiative est l'initiative du genre, ce n'est pas l'initiative des femmes. Donc, du côté du PBF, on est tout à fait disposé à considérer sous la fenêtre de la Gender Initiative une proposition de projet qui travaillerait avec des imams et avec les hommes, notamment autour des normes de la masculinité, de la féminité, de ce que les hommes et femmes peuvent faire, etc. Donc, du moment qu'il y a une vraie dimension de genre, le projet sera recevable. So quickly, a quick summary in English. The question is about radicalization and its linkages its linkages to a religious phenomenon and the importance to work with imam. And I was just pointing out that imam who are men. I was just pointing out that the gender promotion initiative is a gender initiative. It's not a women's initiative. So we are actually, as PBF, very interested in supporting projects that have a very strong gender dimension in the sense of, in that case, to take that example, working with imam and men religious leaders around radicalization, particularly as it influences the gender norms for men and women. There is also, donc je retourne en français, il y a une question sur s'il est possible d'avoir un Gender Marker 3 pour un projet ciblant les femmes et les jeunes. Alors, j'en profite pour répondre à la question suivante qui est aussi sur les liens entre les projets genre et les projets jeunesse. Donc, du côté du PBF, on verra de façon très positive des projets qui lient la dimension genre à la dimension jeune. Mais attention, ça ne veut pas dire qu'un projet qui parle de les femmes et les jeunes sera vu de façon favorable. Ce qui sera intéressant pour nous, c'est un projet, par exemple, qui cible les jeunes, mais avec une dimension de genre très poussée. Donc, qui va regarder la question du rôle des jeunes femmes et des filles adolescentes dans la construction de la paix, qui va faire une analyse de la différence de leur rôle, de leur capacité, des possibilités qui leur sont offertes par rapport aux jeunes hommes, et qui va avoir vraiment des approches stratégiques et adaptées à ces différents groupes pour renforcer leur participation. Donc, il faut éviter, de toute façon, en tant que PBF, on demande de prêter une attention particulière au ciblage et aux groupes avec lesquels vous allez travailler. Donc, on vous invite vraiment à éviter tout ce qui est généralisation au niveau de vos groupes cibles. Donc, c'est la principale chose à éviter. So I'll just quickly summarize. In English, there were a couple of questions about linking gender and youth, and whether that's something that would be acceptable for PBF. So absolutely, that would be the case. For the youth projects, the fact that they should be fully mainstreaming gender is actually a requirement. Projects that do not look at the gender dimension of what they're proposing will actually be excluded. So it is more than, it's not an option, it's actually a requirement. Now, we would be particularly interested in projects that are both, strongly focused on youth and gender, but we really invite you to think carefully about your targeting. So don't submit a project that talks about we'll be working with women and youth, because we will find this too general. A lot of youth are women. A lot of women are also young. So be specific about who you're targeting, and we'd be much more interested in a project that's really telling us that you're going to target young women. You can explain their role in the peace building process, explain the different opportunities and capacities, etc., the type of intervention you'll be designing for them specifically. So be specific in your targeting.
And maybe also just go down one more, because there's a linked question. Another question, we are considering to submit strongly linked proposals for gender and youth. Would that be realistic, or would you suggest to submit twin independent proposals? Don't submit two proposals under the same proposal under both initiatives. We won't be accepting those, because the two windows are not in competition with each other necessarily. So you can submit one project that's strongly looking at the gender dimensions of youth, or vice versa, but please only submit one. But I think, as Cecile said, that strong gender focus is actually a requirement for the Youth Promotion Initiative. So you might want to consider submitting that proposal under the Youth Promotion Initiative rather than the gender one. But it's up to you when you see how the proposal shapes up.
We received a technical question regarding the possibility of saving the application in process through the website. So yes, it should be possible to save the in-process application for all the boxes except for the drop-down menus. If that's not the case, then we will check with our technical support and hope to get that fixed as quickly as possible.
Okay, now there's a question about tax exemption. In the last webinar, we should contact you early in the process about any tax exemption issues to confirm. There's been an email, but we have not gotten back to you yet. That's because we're waiting for feedback from the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office, who is actually our fund administrator. So we will hopefully be getting back to you shortly, but we're waiting for feedback from the actual administrator, since we're not the ones in the Peacebuilding Support Office that actually administer the funds. Yeah, and we'll also try to keep updating the frequently asked questions with the tax questions. Although you can imagine it's very complicated because each country has kind of different laws, and it's complicated to give blanket answers because of the differences in the laws and processes in different countries. Okay, any more questions from the colleagues? There was one question about like securitizing.
Yeah, that's something that we could actually clarify from our side. It wasn't a question from participants, but.
Oh. Okay, yeah, there was another question. We mentioned of the issues related to countering and preventing violent extremism, and Cecile did as well in the question about imams and male leaders in the community. So one thing we want to emphasize, I'm sure all of you are very aware of the debates around preventing violent extremism. The point is, we do not want securitized approaches. We do not want approaches that potentially do harm. We do not want approaches that potentially endanger women or girls or youth or put them in the line of fire for violent extremist groups. So the one thing that I think we would want to see is a very good conflict analysis and theory of change, as well as a very strong risk mitigation for anything that's approaching violent extremism. But I would also encourage you to look at the previous projects that have been funded in this arena. We have some projects in Mali and also in Kyrgyzstan that have focused on preventing radicalization and engaging women and youth groups in civil society efforts to prevent radicalization. So I would encourage you to look at those projects, and then you can get a sense of the kind of approaches that we're interested in. Yeah. Okay, then another question, if you are already a local NGO, is there still a requirement to partner with other CSOs? So the answer to this question is we are, as I mentioned earlier, the partnership with CSOs at the local level is a guideline. It's something that we want to encourage to make sure that this is not reinforcing those who already have access to resources, those who are already in positions of power, but that we're kind of reaching beyond the capital, beyond the UN country team meeting room to access different constituencies and partners for peace. So if you are already a local NGO, then you are already one of those people who are outside of that, usual suspect kind of circle. So without knowing all the details, I think that would be fine. But again, it's a guideline rather than a rule. But the main thing we want to see is that there are consultations and participatory approaches taken with local communities, not just in the capital, not just with the elites.
So there's one more question, and I think we answered that a couple of times, but just for those who might have not joined at that moment yet. So all the recordings of the webinars, as well as the presentation slides in English and in French, will be uploaded to the resource section of the PBF GYPI .org website a couple of days after the actual recording, because we need to cut the video and process it and upload it. So yeah, so please check out the website. Also, for other forms of guidance, there is the guidance note that also in the annex gives you an overview of what will be asked from you once you actually start the application itself. And as well as all questions that we've received so far and answers to those.
Mm-hmm. And let me just say one thing. I mean, I'm not the expert on this, but on the tax issue, if your organization has received funds already from the Peacebuilding Fund or from a UN agency, then the chances are it's fine, because you've already gone through the same type of process that the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office will put you through. So just to say that if your organization is already a recipient of peacebuilding funds or has recently received funds from UNDP or UN Women or any of those, then the likelihood is that the tax issue will be fine, because you've already been able to prove that you're tax exempt in the way that the UN requires you to be.
And just to add to that, so as Sarah mentioned earlier, we're trying to clarify this issue as quickly as possible, and we'll get back to you shortly.
Okay. Any more questions from the colleagues?
Great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to everyone, and we really look forward to receiving your proposals, and we wish you the best of luck in the process, and also thank you for being our partners in gender responsive peace building.